Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to another episode of History and Our Current World, where we examine the importance of myths, memories, and the creation of narratives in global politics. Today, we'll turn toward home and speak with Daniel Immerwahr about the myths that built the United States of America and shaped our place in the global system.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Daniel is the Bergen Evans Professor in the Humanities and Charles Deering McCormick Professor of Teaching Excellence in the History Department at Northwestern University. He is the author of Thinking Small, The United States and the Lure of Community Development, and How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States, both of which have won scholarly awards. Immerwahr is a contributing writer for The New Yorker, and his essays have also appeared in The New York Times, The Guardian, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Harper's, The New Republic, and the New York Review of Books, among other places. He is currently writing a fire history of the United States. Let's listen in on the conversation. All right, welcome back, folks, to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. And for those of you who have been listening throughout this season, we are going over issues and topics related to my class that I teach and looking at history and our current world. And today I'm excited to be joined by another author that I use in one of my courses, Daniel Immerwahr. And Daniel has written the book, How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. Daniel, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
So I'm going to start off by kind of looking at one of the myths that you talk about in your book that is part of American lore. And we've talked about myth and national historical narratives in the last few episodes of the podcast, whether or not that's in the US or, more broadly in other countries, whether that's China or North Korea or Russia. But your book at its heart takes on the myth of what is termed America's, quote, logo map.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about what that is and how you came to be interested in this topic more broadly?
Yeah. And I'll say it's a little differently from a related myth, which is that the United States is not and has never been an empire. It's a myth about the where of the United States rather than the character of the country. And if you ask most people in or outside of the United States to just imagine what it looks like on the map, what they imagine is that contiguous blob bounded by the oceans on either side, and Mexico and Canada to the north and south. The political scientist Benedict Anderson called maps like that the logo map. They would kind of serve as the logo for the country. And whether they should or not is an interesting question. But in the case of the United States, that familiar silhouette has only been the borders of the country for 4 years of its history. So it's just inaccurate. And the reason is that the United States started much smaller, then achieved that shape in the 1850s, and then just kept expanding, taking uninhabited islands, taking vast inhabited territory like Alaska, acquiring a number of overseas territories, the largest of which was the Philippines. And its borders have always been kind of changing. And yet when we tell its history, we usually just tell the history of that place, that contiguous blob, the logo map.
And how'd you get into this topic? How'd you get interested in this? I mean, I know as American historians, you tend to know this history, but you dove into it.
Yeah, let's talk about how you tend to know this history, because I was teaching the U.S. History Survey, and I would get to the point at 1898 where we had to talk about Teddy Roosevelt and the United States' imperial adventure, and it was this story about how the United States claimed a bunch of colonies: Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii, American Samoa, the Philippines. And then the next chapter was, we're off to the progressive era, and we're talking about the interwar period, and then we're talking about the Depression. And those places just weren't coming back at all in the story. It was a moment, not a enduring fact. And so that's how I was teaching it. And that's how it kind of was in the textbooks. And then I traveled to the Philippines unrelated to this reason. And I was in Manila, and I just, was looking around, and I was like, this place has clearly been part of the United States, like unambiguously and obvious. The streets are named after U.S. presidents. Everyone's driving a repurposed U.S. Army Jeep. Like, it's like in all kinds of ways, I felt a sort of cousinship with Filipinos, and it just drove home the thing that I already kind of half knew, which is that the Philippines had been a U.S. colony for about 50 years, and then turned it into like I was like, oh right, I should really think about the implications of that. And then I should also probably think about the implications of Puerto Rico and Hawaii, et cetera, et cetera. And this book kind of tumbled out as a way to retell U.S. history with the overseas bits as part of the unit of analysis.
You explained what the logo myth is. So, and you've talked about it a little bit, and you've mentioned the Philippines and Hawaii and Puerto Rico and things like that. So, what is the reality? What are you explaining to readers to sort of demystify that myth or debunk that myth or just tell an accurate history of US's role in the broader history and in the world in general, or to tell the story of the greater United States, as you call it?
Yeah, so I mean, in one sense, it's a corrective. Unlike you thought
Yeah.
that the borders of the country were this, actually they're that. And there's a way in which correctives can be kind of grim or drab. Don't forget about the Gadsden Purchase. Also, it happens.
I forgot about it.
But like, there's a lot of really good post-colonial theory that makes a point, which is that places that from centers of power seem to be peripheral, i.e. colonies often, actually turn out to be central. Like, a lot of the action of a country happens in those places. And I believe that. And this book is a kind of test of that proposition. So it's not just arguing that, yes, the United States has different borders than you thought, and like, don't forget about the Marshall Islands. It's an argument that, oh, if you want to understand nuclear power, and, the Marshall Islands turned out to be really important. And a lot of history can turn on sometimes small places, sometimes sort of places that are just in the blurry periphery. If you live in, somewhere like Chicago where I live. So it's not just that the United States has had and continues to have overseas territories. It's that those places are really interesting and potentially central to U.S. history.
Yeah, to your point, just the history of the Philippines and the Pacific War and the centrality of the Philippines for the United States from 1941 to 1945, just to name 4 years out of our history with the Philippines. But you tell a story for our listeners, little background detail. Daniel was here on campus at Georgetown last month, I think it was, to give a dean's research seminar talk. And I went to the talk. This will be a little bit different without pictures and slides and things like that. But you talked about the nature of this even 70 years ago, 80 years ago, when World War II started, and the edits that FDR went through in writing his speech about Pearl Harbor and Hawaii, drawing Hawaii into the equation here. And I found that to be fascinating. And also the story of the girls' school writing letters to Rand McNally about their maps and things like that. But can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is how the book starts. The reason I put it first is these were kind of edifying and exciting moments for me doing the research. So first of all, Pearl Harbor, one of the most famous episodes in U.S. history. Pearl Harbor was the one place where the U.S. was attacked during World War II on its own soil. And then the rest of the war was fought overseas. And what that ignores is that there were other U.S. territories that were also attacked. Philippines, Guam, Alaska, in fact. Most of those territories were also attacked on the same day as Pearl Harbor. In the same moment. In fact, the military damage done to the Philippines was judged by the U.S. Army's official history of the war to be as great as the damage done at Pearl Harbor. So you're like, wait, why are we talking about, why is this event called Pearl Harbor? When in fact, it takes place over thousands of miles across the Pacific. And the damage done to the Philippines isn't just military, because the attack on the Philippines is followed by an invasion and an occupation of the Philippines, which pulls the Philippines into the bloody edge of the war for the United States. Hawaii has a rough World War II, but mainly that roughness has to do with the economic and political constraints, kind of logistical hub for the United States. The Philippines, World War II kills more than 1 million people. It is, in fact, the bloodiest event that happens in U.S. history on U.S. soil, and it's not even in the textbooks.
I mean, that's got to boggle people's minds.
Yeah.
That fact right there.
Weird, like, segregation of like what is U.S. history and what is
Right.
foreign history. And the Philippines, despite being a U.S. territory this entire time, And despite, FDR being the commander in chief, it's like an over there kind of space in a lot of people's minds. And
And
there's,
just real quick before you continue on the story about the Pearl Harbor speech, that gets back to that opening question and comment about viewing the United States as an empire or not, and our attempts to be viewed as not an empire.
yeah,
So you
yeah,
don't want to talk about the Philippines as American soil in the 1940s or 1930s, because that would then call into question whether or not we were an empire and did we act the way that other countries did that we are trying not to be like, or we're trying to differentiate ourselves from. But anyways, continue the story. The writing of the speech itself I found fascinating.
let's come back to the empire thing because that's going to turn out to be an important theme. So, okay, the event of Pearl Harbor already has a kind of instability, right? Like, what happened? Where did it happen? Those are historical questions for us, but there are also questions at the time. Early newspaper coverage of the event that we call 9/11 was unsure exactly how to narrate it. Remember, there were multiple targets, not just the World Trade Center. And it took a while for the kind of, we're going to call this 9/11,
Yeah.
emphasize the World Trade Center. Like, then it kind of got settled as historical memory. Same thing happened with Pearl Harbor. So the word Pearl Harbor was not lexically available to anyone at the time as a way of describing the event. So it was like an attack on Hawaii and Guam in one paper, an attack on the Philippines and Hawaii in another. And Eleanor Roosevelt's speech refers to it as principally an attack on Hawaii and the Philippines. There's a draft of FDR's speech produced by his trusted Undersecretary of State, Sumner Welles, that also emphasized the two events. And then FDR tears up the draft, gives his own version of the speech, writes his own version, and we have his edits. And what you see in his edits is he starts with, this is an event that took place mainly in Hawaii and the Philippines, and he crosses out the Philippines. And what you see is he's like, I am nervous that people in my audience will not understand the Philippines to be part of the United States. Frankly, I'm a little worried about Hawaii too, but Hawaii has significantly more white people from the mainland. So you can kind of round it up, whereas the Philippines, much harder. And you can see FDR making a, I think, correct, intelligent political calculation, which is that you cannot say the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, therefore they attacked the United States of America, therefore that we're at war. That chain of inference will not hold in the popular mind. So he just kind of takes the Philippines out of the speech, emphasizes Hawaii, and then that becomes the, like, we have to go to war speech.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating and makes sense, like you said, from a political standpoint for FDR. And there was another one that I had mentioned. Oh, the map, the schoolgirls.
Oh, yeah, yes.
Another fascinating
I
story.
love this.
These are all in Daniel's introduction to the book, but really set the stage for then what he talks about in the book, and like all of these different myths that we have in America and things we've been talking about on the podcast, but through an American lens this time.
FDR also says, not in the Pearl Harbor speech, but in other speeches, by maps, by atlases, because I'm going to be narrating through a series of fireside chats a global war, and I want you to understand where all these places are. It's kind of an amazing moment, pedagogically speaking. And so I found archival evidence of a classroom in Kalamazoo, Michigan, that has bought from Rand McNally a wartime map of the world. And they're doing the thing. They're following, all the war on the map, looking at the places. And one girl flips to the back of the map and flips to an index. And the index is divided. So there's an index of domestic places and there's an index of foreign places. And she looks on the index of foreign places and she sees Hawaii, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. Presumably this is how it goes down. She asks her teachers, like, in what sense are these far? Right? Like, I thought Hawaii was part of the United States. Literally, isn't that why we're fighting the war?
Right.
And so the teacher turns it into an exercise. All the girls write about this and they write to Rand McNally. What is the answer to this question? And Rand McNally writes back this insane answer. I mean, it's not emotionally aggressive, but it's just like, yeah, well, Hawaii's not really, it's far into our continental shores is the word they use. So therefore it cannot be shown as part of the United States proper. I don't even know what that means. So the girls send the entire correspondence to the Secretary of the Interior during World War II and ask for an adjudication. And they send Rand McNally's response and they say, we think this is an alibi, not an explanation. And the Interior Department amazingly writes back and they side with the girls. Yes, Hawaii is part of the United States, so are the Philippines, so is Puerto Rico. But it's just like gets at this moment, like even after FDR's speech, even the map maker is a little unsure about whether Hawaii counts as part of the United States. And in my book, I try to argue that that blurriness, that uncertainty just haunts US history. All these places where the US flag flies in various ways, are kind of part of the United States. They're under US jurisdiction, but we have a way of just editing them out, of selectively cropping the family portrait. And that just produces this constant confusion, a confusion which is kind of laughable in the story of this, seventh grade girls in Cal again. But of course is absolutely terrifying if it's World War II and you live in the Philippines and you're wondering if you're going to get military protection.
Yeah, and these are, fascinating stories, interesting stories, but they paint this picture of something that is horrifying when this is like the lack of knowledge at the current moment of reality, but also historically looking back and still seeing all of this history that's not known. And the United States is talked about in a way that's like we've never been an empire and we're not an empire. We've never acted like one, and that has effects on the current day and people's thinking in the current day. We'll get to that in a second because I have some other specific questions about how you feel that affects us today still. And interesting that we're talking about map makers as well on where to align the Philippines when we're now having arguments with Google about what to call the Gulf of America or the Gulf of Mexico. But I mentioned that I use this in my course in one of my classes, and my students always are blown away by one or two things that they find in there that shocks them because they didn't know it about US history and US diplomatic history. So besides the Pearl Harbor one, what were other things that you found out throughout your course of researching this and getting into it that you were just like, I can't believe this? Not only that it happened or that it was true, that you didn't know it.
Yeah. So, I think all books are written with a kind of dominant presiding emotion. And some books it's rage, and other books it's sort of antiquarian glee. I mean, there's all kinds of ways we get into what we get into.
Yeah.
I will say that the emotion that felt most important to me in the researching and therefore in the writing of the book was, holy shit, I can't believe I didn't know that. And it's frankly embarrassing, like how many of the things that are in this book, as a historian, got a PhD in US history with an interest in US Asian relations, oriented toward foreign affairs, like how little of this I knew when I started the research. The thing that I would say most blew my mind was not a remedial thing, not something that like a lot of other people knew. I didn't know it, which is true of some of the things in the book. But the thing that most blew my mind was something that I'd never seen a historian talk about, which has to do with the name of the country. So the name of the country is the United States of America, and that's like a bit of a mouthful. And as a result, people have historically throughout its history found ways to refer to it by something else, like a nickname, possibly a shortening. So the most common nickname that we use now is America. And we know the problems with that. Actually, the Americas is quite large, and what we call America is only part of it. And it's sort of insulting to Latin Americans and Canadians that story. So interestingly, America was not that common at the start as a name for the country. And there was a lot of talk in the early republic about what to call the country in nickname. And actually, a fairly common way to do it in a literary mode was to call it Columbia, which is why a lot of the early anthems, Hail Columbia, Columbia, Gem of the Ocean, etc., refer to it as Columbia, not America. In fact, it is impossible to find an anthem that refers to the country as America for the first 100 years or so of its history. The people of the country were often called Americans, not always. I mean, there would be other ways to refer to it, but that was pretty frequent. But I went through like presidential speech of sitting presidents looking for how often they referred to the country during the time when it was the United States, not colonial America, as America. And they do it, but they don't do it a lot. They do it about like once every 11 years. And they have other ways of referring to the country. So they'll call it the United States, which we do too. The U states, we don't do that one anymore. The Republic.
Thankfully, that's
and I would go for the U states. Yeah, that's where it's the Republic, the Union. So those are the most common ways to do it. If you're being very highfalutin, maybe Columbia, but otherwise the United States, the Republic, or the Union. And it is not It is the act of taking a lot of overseas populated territories in and immediately after 1898. That's when things change, because you suddenly have a country that includes Puerto Rico, that includes Hawaii, that includes the Philippines. And it just becomes a lot harder for people at the time to imagine that it is really a union of states, really a republic, because it is transparently not. Does it think Hawaii is going to become a state? I mean, it does, but not a lot of people think that at the time. And they
Well,
really
1898.
exactly. Right. So this is when you start seeing new names, maybe we call it the Greater Republic. And then you also see a kind of really pronounced shift toward America, which, unlike the other names, says nothing about the political character of the place. So that's when presidents really start talking about America. And that's when you start seeing the anthems, America the Beautiful, God Bless America.
That's interesting, and just goes to the broader discussion of how we viewed ourselves even when we were doing well. It fits into a larger pattern, but 1898 is the first time that it's like really out there, right? And not on the continent and everything. So we know this is harder to cover up
Yes.
than
Yes.
before.
And you get people like Teddy Roosevelt being like, "What? We've always been an empire. What do you think we were doing with the Apaches?"
Yeah,
That was
exactly.
like straight
Yeah.
up, we
Yeah.
haven't changed character. You just noticed. Yeah. So it was a kind of wild moment, and it's also wild because the 1898 moment is really a moment of like forthright imperial cartography. Like the maps really do have the Philippines on them in 1900 in a way that they just don't by 1920. Whereas much of the U.S. history is a history of hiding empire. There is a brief like window of clarity. And
Yeah.
it's kind of intellectually interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And like an out and out open argument among imperialists and anti-imperialists over the fact that the US is acting in an imperial way overseas, and should we continue to do this, should we not? And that argument, I think, transcends that time period, but it's blatantly obvious that it's about that.
I'd say the 1900 election
Yeah.
is like the only presidential election where empire is described as such, is just a major debate issue, major campaign issue.
Foreign policy can come in, but it's not couched in those terms before that or since then. And speaking of the use of Columbia, just as a quick side note, another book I've used in my class before is called Past and Prologue by Michael Haddam. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but it looks at U.S. memory around the Revolution and how colonists viewed themselves as English and how they flipped that within like a decade period to sort of write their own histories of them as Americans instead of Brits up until the Revolution. And then after the Revolution, how they began to create a history of themselves as Americans distinct from British. And he talks about this use of Columbia and Columbus and how they brought that into it, which I think is one of the reasons you would have seen Columbia used as a term in the early 19th century and stuff.
Yeah, one of the most important reflections on national identity, literary reflections on national identity in the early republic, is a poem called the Columbiad, where Columbus is really important because Columbus is not British. Right? So the way to have an American identity that is distinct from the British identity.
Even though he never set foot on what would become the United States,
He did.
still.
He did. He set foot in Puerto Rico.
Well, there you go.
You walked right into that one.
I did, man. I didn't know he went to Puerto Rico, but I wanted to segue to Puerto Rico because one of my favorite parts about the book is when you discuss the failed assassination attempt of Harry Truman by Puerto Rican nationalists.
Yeah.
And again, it's like, well, why were Puerto Rican nationalists trying to assassinate the president of the United States? That would be the question 99.9% of Americans would probably ask. And it's like, well, because the United States controls Puerto Rico. And, oh, by the way, we still do.
Yeah. So, Kelly, you say that would be the question that what 99% of mainlanders would ask. But I went through the newspaper accounts of that event. So let's just say what happens. There is an 8-city uprising that encompasses Puerto Rico and the mainland, led by Puerto Rican nationalists. It's kind of a last gasp attempt to have a sort of violent revolt that will lead to independence, like it's an independence struggle. And it includes a very nearly successful assassination attempt, Harry Truman. And it shakes Truman up to the point where he cites it as a reason that he does not run for re-election. So it is nearly extraordinarily consequential because it nearly assassinates a president. And even as an attempted assassination, it's quite consequential for U.S. politics and obviously for Puerto Rican politics as well. U.S. coverage, mainland coverage of that is shocking in how little it engages with any of the issues that we might want to engage with. I mean, one of the assassins is quite vocal on why he did it. Colonialism, history of colonialism. He
Yeah.
speaks really eloquently about this. And yet the U.S. coverage is like, I don't know, man, Puerto Ricans are crazy. Sometimes they have guns, just lunatics, right?
Yeah, we have no idea why he
Right.
did why they did this.
Well, the only explanation can be pathological because there can be no interesting engagement with the history of
Yeah.
U.S. colonialism because U.S. colonialism doesn't officially really super exist.
Yeah,
So,
we don't. How could we talk about it?
yeah. So it's just like Puerto Ricans being nuts, which, I submit as a historian is not actually a very compelling explanation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to bring this forward to today now because my class is History's Influence on Foreign Affairs, and the season is about history in our current world. So, how, after writing this book, researching it, looking at it for years now, and now 5 years or so removed from publishing it, how do you see this still affecting the United States today? Whether or not it's just the basics of people not understanding our real history and that, Puerto Rico is part of the United States and that we did control the Philippines for a long time, just from that aspect of it. But also, there's people that have this myth of America's role in the world and view it as a more benevolent kind of, we don't do empire, we don't do colonialism, we act in the world for altruistic reasons. They have that as their sort of foundational personal narrative myth of the United States.
Yeah.
How do you see that kind of affecting us still today? I don't know if you've read a book I use in classes, Looking for the Good War by Elizabeth
Yep.
Samet,
Yeah.
which is fantastic if you're familiar with that book. But
Yes, that's
yeah. So she talks about how that affects basically everything that's come since in U.S. foreign policy making.
yeah. So yeah, let's talk about that. There's a long-standing debate about whether the United States is an empire or not.
Right.
So I'm far from the first person on the mainland to argue that the United States has been an empire. Absolutely not. But usually that debate is a debate over character. Often it's who we are rather than a debate over the map, where we are. And I thought that what I would be doing would be entering that debate from a kind of unexpected direction and note that even the people who are quite critical of U.S. foreign relations and therefore most likely to refer to the U.S.'s actions on the world stage as empire, not, for example, leadership, that even those people are often fairly ignorant or slow to engage with the United States' actual history of territorial acquisition and governance, et cetera. So often the case for the U.S. as empire is much more Vietnam and Iraq than it is Puerto Rico and the Philippines. So I thought that I was going to be sort of coming in sideways and saying like, well, yeah, I mean, technically the United States is an empire in a fairly incontrovertible way. And there's a huge and interesting history there that I would really like to tell, but I'm not trying to kind of win the debate that you guys are having, which is about the character of U.S. foreign policy. Maybe I was a little naive. The book was largely received within the context of that existing debate. So I got a lot of hate mail from people who feel very attached to the reputation of the country. How dare you slander this wonderful nation?
Yeah.
And then I got a lot of love mail from people who were like really grumpy with the US. I knew it was an empire and you just showed it. Which, but in both cases, I felt like, I was like, that's not exactly the terms I was proposing. But I get why it was received that way, because once you make this sort of spatial adjustment and you talk about the U.S. within its real borders, you are dealing with the fact that the United States has had an imperial government, and imperial governments are really not a great form of government. Like, they involve enormous amounts of violence, needless deaths. I mean, sometimes it's sort of active racist killing, and sometimes it's just sort of like, we don't have to really think too hard about things that are happening in Puerto Rico and
Right.
they resolve themselves. And guess what? That's not a great form of government either. So it is a fairly damning portrait of how imperial governance works. And so it is true that when you change the unit of analysis, you also change the story that you tell. And if you are mainly plugged into the moral valence of that story, which I was not as writing it, you do end up with a darker story. Like that's just true.
Yeah. And on the flip side of that as well, though, I think not having that story could make you more apt to be in line or advocate for certain policies in the current day because you don't have that dark past,
Yeah, yeah,
and I think that's where a healthy dose of both sides of that need to be more out there in the real world.
yeah. And this feels, when I was writing the book, it felt terribly relevant because climate change was and is threatening the US overseas possessions even more than it's threatening its mainland. So the 2017 hurricane season had been, truly awful in the US Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And then there'd been another major typhoon that hit the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. And that just seemed like that was going to keep happening.
Yeah.
However, we're also in really surprising to me moment, which is a seeming reversion toward enthusiasm toward territorial conquest on behalf of the US president. And that is the kind of enthusiasm. I don't know how widely shared it is among even the MAGA base, but like that kind of just optimistic sense that once the United States, I don't know, clears Gaza of Palestinians and sets it up as a tourist resort, things will be fine.
Yeah.
That's like a kind of optimism that is only possible to maintain if you
Yeah.
have
Well, that's where all the US citizens of Greenland can go for their vacations.
there too,
to get
right? And that requires a foreshortened understanding of U.S. history.
Yes, 100%. And yeah, it's interesting that, speaking of 1898 and William McKinley and the election of 1900, we're in a time period where McKinley gets a shout out in the inauguration speech and talking about his great, beautiful tariffs, and empire might be in vogue again, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think the basic methodology of the book is worth remembering. I don't know what's going to happen with all these Trump annexation feints, and I kind of
Yeah.
regard these more bluster than anything else. But it is a reminder that a lot of politics is often worked out on the quote unquote edges, on spaces that might seem peripheral, which, a lot turns on them. And I feel like we're in a moment where that's pretty plausible analysis as well.
All right, Daniel, thank you so much. We could have this conversation for hours. There's so many other things we haven't gotten into from the book and fascinating stuff. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Pleasure.
Thanks again to Daniel for his time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.